Okay, big news coming in from the Supreme Court. That flash says it all. Electoral bond scheme has been struck down as unconstitutional by the highest court of the land. In fact, our colleague Ashmit has been in the courtroom. He's been giving us the latest updates. The Supreme Court goes on to say, and this is a judgment I'm reading from, allowing corporates to make unlimited contributions is arbitrary. Contributions made by corporates are purely business transactions for influencing policy. This is very strong and very straightforward, direct language coming in from the court. Earlier, only a certain percentage of net profit was allowed to be made. So basically, just to go back and give you some context, as you know, we keep playing this out on the flashes and on the graphics. Electoral bonds were basically nameless and faceless, and contributions could have been made. They were introduced, if I remember correctly, in about 2016 or 17. Prior to that, there were certain limits on how much a company could contribute to a political party or for a political cause. There was a limit on percentage of net profit. I think it was about 10%, if one remembers correctly. But all of those sort of checks and balances, if one could say, were perhaps done away once electoral bonds came in, because, as I'm saying, it was nameless and faceless. So just to go back to talk about what else the court has said. So yeah, it's very clear and emphatic that electoral bond scheme has been struck down as unconstitutional.
It's a violation of fundamental right. It's unconstitutional. Allowing corporates to make unlimited contributions is arbitrary. They're issuing a backstop on all the issuance of electoral bonds. And so just trying to get some more detail. Yeah. But this is a big development in the run-up to, the elections of 2024.
Absolutely. This is massive because we're running into, election season full throttle. One of the reasons that has been cited by the court is that electoral bonds violate the right to information. And it is on that premise that the court has struck down these bonds as unconstitutional. And the fact that corporates are being allowed to make all of these, unlimited contributions arbitrary, that is exactly the court's language that we are quoting from. We'll try and get...
Basically, the citizens need to be informed about the source of this political funding. Yeah. The fact that these electoral bonds can be purchased by anyone, they're nameless, they're faceless, it's discreet, it defeats the citizen's right to information about the source of funding. The citizen needs to be aware of the sources of funding of the political parties, and that perhaps has been, the basic principle behind the Supreme Court making this landmark judgment.
Okay, and the court has asked State Bank of India to submit details of all the bonds that have been purchased since April 2019 to the Election Commission. So there's disclosure that the Apex Court has directed on all the bonds that have been purchased from April 2019. Remember, SBI was the bank. That was sort of the nodal agency, the nodal financial institution through which the scheme was being rolled out. And the bonds had different face value, I think 1,000 rupees going all the way up to 1 crore rupees. And you could simply walk in, give a donation there. And of course, KYC was required, but the name of the donor, the identity of the donor was being kept secure. And now the court has said that the Election Commission needs to be made aware of all the donations that have been received from April 2019. That's, of course, just before the previous general election. And given that it's coming in just months away before we get into poll season full throttle, this is absolutely massive, impacts the manner in which, of course, electoral funding is taking place in the country. So, Reema, just to go back in time, even before these bonds came in, corporates could always contribute, and they did contribute. But there were some checks and balances in terms of how much of your cash flow, how much of net profit, could be sort of given to this. But, once the identity aspect was taken away with electoral bonds, we, of course, had this whole issue arising about lack of transparency. And that's exactly the line that the Supreme Court seems to have taken by saying that it violates the right to information, and therefore electoral bonds are unconstitutional. Just trying to see if there are any additional... Yeah, I think Ashmit should be coming out. He's been sending us the live updates from the court. And this is a quick verdict, actually, that came in. The matter came up at around, I think, 10 o'clock. And by 10:30, we had the bench sort of come out with its verdict there. That's what we have. That is the news of the hour. By the way, while sort of pronouncing the judgment, the Apex Court also cited that knowing the identity in certain cases can get catastrophic. We do have some reactions to quickly sort of weigh in on this big news. We have Supreme Court advocate Sanjay Hegde joining us on the phone line. Mr. Hegde, good morning. Thanks so much for joining in. This is perhaps landmark. So electoral bonds get struck down as unconstitutional. Your thoughts?
This is history, because when money has sought to speak through in our democracy, in our electoral democracy, when money has sought to influence electoral democracy, the Supreme Court has said that you cannot do it any further. The Supreme Court has also said that all information on electoral bonds, since they were challenged in the court, have to be submitted by the SBI to the Election Commission, which will then put it on a website. So today we shall hopefully soon know who exactly paid whom at what stage.
Okay, Mr. Hegde, just stay on. I think Shereen is also joining in. Let's bring her into the whole conversation as well. Shereen, no, what a landmark moment, right?
Well, this is a historical judgment, and Sanjay Hegde, congratulations to you. Of course, he's one of the lawyers for the petitioners, along with Prashant Bhushan, Kapil Sibal, Raju Ramchandran, Nizam Pasha, Shadan Farsad. These have been the petitioners in this matter. Just for the benefit of our viewers, Surabhi, a little bit of background. Remember, this was November 2nd, 2023, when the Supreme Court had reserved its judgment. The argument had lasted 3 days, and today the Supreme Court delivering a unanimous verdict saying that the electoral bond scheme is violative of the Constitution, and making it very, very clear that the information now needs to be made public. Sanjay Hegde, were you expecting this order?
Well, let me put it this way. There were a lot of people who were very pessimistic. I kept hoping, but this is a judgment which will go down in history. Often I have pointed out that rarely has the Supreme Court struck down any measure where the government has invested political capital. The last thing I can remember is 50 years ago, when the court struck down bank nationalization through ordinance. Therefore, this is a very important judgment, and most importantly, it is unanimous. Though the Chief Justice has written for 4 of the judges, Justice Khanna has written for himself, and Justice Khanna is likely to be the next Chief Justice in November this year. So it does show that there will be a continuity of the process. Later on also, electoral bonds are now effectively taken off the table. And the court must also be congratulated for delivering a judgment timely before the Lok Sabha elections kick in.
Absolutely. That's an important point that you make, that this judgment is not just historical, but it's also important because it comes just ahead of the general elections, which we are, of course, awaiting the Election Commission to announce a date. But again, to put this into context for our viewers, this was a 5-judge bench headed by the Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud, Sanjeev Khanna, part of the bench, B.R. Gawai, part of the bench, J.B. Pardiwala, part of the bench, and Manoj Mishra, part of the bench. And as Sanjay Hegde was pointing out, this is a unanimous order of the Supreme Court. I think we also do have Dushyant Dave with us. He, of course, has not been a lawyer for the petitioners in this matter, but if we do have Mr. Dave, Sanjay Hegde saying this will go down in history as one of the most significant orders of the Supreme Court. Your first reaction on the Supreme Court striking down the electoral bond scheme?
I think it's a welcome judgment. And it really is going to send down fantastic signals that we cannot have any kind of impurity in our election process, because the entire electoral bond scheme was shrouded in secrecy. It was completely a dark scheme, and it was a scheme which really struck a blow to the independence of election process, because it encouraged, unfortunately, the corporate world to naturally veer towards the party in power and to really not support the opposition parties, because, government always had access to find out who was being, funded by to the opposition parties. So I think Supreme Court has put it very beautifully that this is a right to information that citizens have. It is arbitrary. And I would say it also violates the, right to purity of the election. So I think that voters' right has now been restored. And one must really appreciate that Supreme Court has done this at a very apt time. And it will really, perhaps to somewhat extent, bring about some sanity back into the electoral process, which unfortunately institutions like Election Commission and have not been able to maintain. So I think this is a very powerful message to the government that you cannot have these kind of schemes which will encourage dishonesty in election process, and we must therefore have honest election process. So I think to that extent this is a remarkable judgment.
Mr. Dave, I'm just going to bring in my colleague Ashmit Kumar, who has, of course, been tracking the action in the Supreme Court. But before I get to Ashmit, just to understand what happens now on the ground, Mr. Dave, because amendments were made to the Companies Act, to the IT Act, to the RC Act, to exempt parties, political parties and companies from disclosure of funding details. Now the Supreme Court has made it clear that SBI must furnish all of the details to the Election Commission. The government had removed the cap on corporate donations. The earlier cap of 7.5% of average net profits of the last 3 financial years, that cap was done away with. So essentially with this order, all of this is wound down, correct?
Yes, it will result in status quo ante. As we have all known, government brought all these amendments to finance bill, which itself was unconstitutional and shocking. And therefore, every one of these amendments which have been made to facilitate this kind of a dishonest scheme will have to be, undone by the government. I mean, judgment itself undoes it. So a judgment has really set at naught that entire amendments which were brought in various clauses, as you rightly mentioned. So I think the best would be for the government to go back to the transparent scheme and allow corporates to donate to the political parties in a transparent manner, and perhaps give some kind of income tax exemptions to them for doing so. So government will have to perhaps bring an ordinance to set things right and to ensure that the elections are fought with white money and not with black money, as has been happening for the last 77 years. So I think government should, with all humility, accept this judgment in letter and spirit and really act fast and bring some kind of notification, some kind of ordinance to really do something which will restore the original position as soon as possible, so that the forthcoming elections are fought on a transparent basis.
Yeah, well, we have to wait for the government reaction. We haven't heard from the government yet. Remember, the Supreme Court has just delivered its verdict. Ashmit Kumar standing outside the Supreme Court. History being made today, Ashmit, important order coming in from the Supreme Court, that 5-judge bench basically saying that the electoral bond scheme is shrouded in secrecy and it is violative of the Constitution. For the benefit of our viewers, Ashmit, take us through the key arguments presented by the bench headed by D.Y. Chandrachud.
Well, at the heart of the matter, this has been a conflict between, one, the right of privacy, the right of confidentiality of donors so that they don't experience any form of political vengeance, and on the other, the right to information that is claimed by the voters. That was the entire contest here. The petitioners had argued that in light of participatory democracy, this is critical for people to know who are the donors who are standing behind political parties. That is critical in making that decision as to when the vote is cast. This was the conversation that was in fact flagged. Another conversation that was flagged by the petitioners is that the nature of the electoral bond scheme is such that it allows for access to the government. Now, that was a claim made by the petitioners, severely rebutted by the centre, but nonetheless, that is something that appears to have struck a chord with the apex court. Over the course of the arguments, even the Supreme Court had observed that there does appear to be some form of selective confidentiality. Now, that's as far as what petitioners had been claiming all along. The government on its part, however, was very clear that number one, the electoral bond scheme only provides for white money, only provides for money that is enabled through KYC checked accounts, and therefore there is that stamp no black money coming into the political system. Also argued that this confidentiality is critical for ensuring that there is no political backlash against donors to one political party or the other, and this was the main sum and substance of the arguments that they had put across. The Supreme Court today, in trying to balance the right of confidentiality of the donors versus right to information of the voters, has said that number one, the electoral bond scheme is not the minimally restrictive mechanism available. There are other tools available which do not impose such a high cost as to not let the voters know who the donors are. And in fact goes on to say that as far as even donations are concerned, and this is important from a corporate perspective, saying that allowing corporates to make unlimited donations is something that may not be tenable, is not sustainable, is not healthy, for the very reason, the Supreme Court reasons that the political contributions by companies are towards very specific pointed ends and not really a show of political support. So at the end of the day, we have a scenario where the Supreme Court has struck down the entire electoral bond scheme in its entirety. So that means any amendments that were made related to the IT Act, the Companies Act, all have been struck down. The Supreme Court very clearly holding, I beg your pardon, that SBI will have to disclose details of the donor details, the parties that encash these bonds, all these details from April 2019 till date. So that's nearly a 4-year period. The bonds that were encashed in this period will have to be made known. The SBI will have to share that information with the Election Commission, and there's a very pointed direction towards the Election Commission to go ahead and to publish this on the website. And importantly, the final caveat that the Apex Court has added is that any electoral bonds which are currently lying with the political parties have to be returned. This scheme is simply not kosher, simply not tenable going forward. So a huge setback coming in for the government, and an important, hugely important decision coming from the Apex Court just ahead of the Lok Sabha elections.
Mr. Dave, to the point that Ashmit was making now about the information being made public, SBI has, of course, been asked to share all of this with the Election Commission. But I would imagine that this is going to be a sticky one, not just for political parties, but also for corporate donors. Mr. Dave?
Yes.
No, I was asking you, I said that, now that the Supreme Court has ruled that the information must be made public and SBI must share the data with the Election Commission, this is going to be sticky not just for political parties, and of course it is the BJP which has garnered the maximum electoral bond donations. As per data from the Election Commission, it shows 57% of total donations between 2018 and March 2020 through the electoral bonds went to the BJP, amounting to 5,271 crore rupees. But this is also going to then be a sticky one now for corporate donors with this information being made public.
Well, let me tell you one thing, that in today's environment, this judgment perhaps practically may not make any impact, because the corporate world is really afraid to give money to the opposition, because they will then be visited by the ED, the income tax, and the CBI. Everybody knows what's happening in this country today. While this judgment is path-breaking, undoubtedly, and it declares the scheme to be unconstitutional, in effect, I doubt this judgment will really have any impact, because, there is no level playing field today. There is, as you have seen, that the BJP has received almost 80% of the corporate donations, while the other opposition gets about 20%. And besides this, the monies that they have in the Prime Minister's, PM Care scheme and many other schemes that the BJP has access to, I think the opposition will find it very difficult really to find the genuine supporters from the industry. Everybody knows the consequences. So, it would be very difficult for, even if you try and legalize it in some way, nobody will be willing to support the opposition. More so because there is a writing on the wall that the BJP is on a winning streak now.
Yes, well, we will have to wait to hear from the Election Commission as well as from the government. No reaction so far at this point in time. We will also wait to see what the State Bank of India has to say, because that has been the issuing bank as far as the electoral bonds were concerned. Mr. Dave, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18. Dushyant Dave there with his take. Let's go across. We have Prashant Bhushan, the lawyer for the petitioner in this matter, joining us. Mr. Bhushan, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV18. A big day for electoral transparency, with this unanimous verdict coming in from the Supreme Court. Mr. Bhushan, your first reaction to what the Supreme Court has said?
No, I think it's a very, very significant judgment which will have a far-reaching effect on our electoral democracy, because they have ruled that, number one, anonymous political contributions are unconstitutional to political parties. And secondly, they have also ruled that this kind of unlimited political donations to political parties, by removing the restrictions by companies, unlimited donations by companies to political parties, also violates the level playing field of our electoral democracy. So therefore, they have struck down the removal of those restrictions which restricted political donations by companies to 7.5% of their annual profits. Yeah. So that has also been struck down. And most importantly, they have directed that the State Bank should disclose who had contributed, who had purchased these electoral bonds, and who has encashed these which political parties have encashed these electoral bonds. And that information should be eventually put out on a public website so that the people can see who had purchased these bonds and to which political parties they had given them and when. Very significant.
A very significant order indeed. One of the other lawyers for the petitioners, Kapil Sibal, also with us. Mr. Bhushan, I would request you to hold on and join the conversation here on CNBC TV18. Mr. Sibal, a big day for petitioners in this matter. Unanimous verdict coming in from the Supreme Court, a bench headed by D.Y. Chandrachud, striking down the electoral bond scheme as being unconstitutional. The impact and the implications of this decision, Mr. Sibal.
The impact actually is yet to be seen, and I'll tell you why. Because this opens up the way of finding out who all were funding the BJP, because over the years they've got about 5,000 to 6,000 crores through this funding. That is all illegal now that the scheme itself has been struck down. So we'll get to know who the people are. We'll then be able to find out what kind of quid pro quo happened, because it must have happened. Thereafter, I think that this gives us the foundation of a new political movement as to how the BJP has been using this illegal money that they have amassed through these illegal bonds, and tell the people of this country as to how they are using or misusing this money for political power, how they have through this money built their offices, how they have through this money built offices for the RSS, how through this money they have built their networks, that is their communication networks, because all this money was for the BJP. It was not used in any election. It had nothing to do with elections. And we also will get to know what is the extent of black money that has come into the system, which has been converted into legitimate money. So all this has huge implications for the polity of our country. And I think at last we see some sunlight through an order of the Supreme Court.
Yes, significant implications. But Mr. Sibal, I just wanted to understand, because we are still looking at the fine print of the order, while the State Bank of India has been asked to furnish all the details starting April 2019 to date with the Election Commission. Is there a time period that's been specified by the Supreme Court for them to do so?
Yes, the time period is that within 1 week of that, the Election Commission will disclose it, put it on their website to the people at large. Within 1 week of that. That means by 15th March, everything will have to be disclosed.
By 15th March, everything will have to be disclosed.
Yeah, I mean, they're given 3 weeks to the State Bank of India and 1 week thereafter. So you can calculate 4 weeks from the date of this judgment. Whatever that date is, that's the day when the people of India will get to know who contributed what to which political party. 13th of March, probably. Absolutely. That's the date. 13th is a lucky number for some and unlucky for others.
Well, that is the date which is expected to be the date by when this information should be made public. Mr. Sibal, many changes were brought into a whole plethora of acts, including the Companies Act and so on and so forth. The restrictions on the capping of corporate donations, etc., were also done away with. So as of today, we essentially wind back the clock on all of those amendments and changes?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The scheme itself has been struck down, so whatever the law was prevailing at that particular time, when the scheme was launched, and this was my good friend, the late Arun Jaitley's baby. So that's all been struck down now. And I've been saying this for many, many years, that this is a scheme to enrich the political party. It's not meant for elections at all. In fact, electoral bonds is an entire misnomer. It has nothing to do with elections. It is the bonding between the corporate sector and the BJP. That's what it is.
So now, as far as the Election Commission is concerned, outside of making this data public and available for public consumption, what do you believe the Election Commission will now need to also ensure?
Considering that the Election Commission has been aligned to this government, and we've seen that over the years, I don't expect the Election Commission to do anything. But the fact of the matter is that this is illegal money. And if it's illegal money, and since it is illegal money, then some consequences will follow, should follow. How that will happen is something that we'll have to address.
But, you say that this is illegal money, Mr. Sibal, and, this money, of course, a large proportion or a lion's share of the proportion has gone to the BJP. But what happens now as far as this money itself is concerned? I mean, we don't know if it has been used, how much of it has been used, and so on and so forth. What happens now to the money that's been collected via the electoral bond scheme?
That's the whole problem now, that it's been collected. It should not have been collected. It could not have been collected. The scheme was illegal, so it is illegal in the hands of the BJP.
So which means that, is there a possibility of a return?
Well, I don't know about that. I think that some steps will have to be taken, but that's really part of the political movement which must be built up in this country, and expose the BJP and its machinations. This is how they are toppling state governments, controlling politics in the country. This is the use of this money.
So, Mr. Sibal, before I let you go, we are, of course, waiting for the Election Commission to announce the dates of the upcoming general elections, as well as the Model Code of Conduct to kick in. We haven't got any clarity on that so far. Ahead of the general elections, with this scheme being struck down, what do you see as the big impact, if any?
I think this should be part of a whole national movement in all political parties, and I hope some people from the BJP also get together, because we're talking about this country and the future of this country and the role money plays in the politics of this country, and it can skew the entire federal structure of this country through the use of this money. It can stymie politics. It can stymie democracy. In fact, this kind of money power can actually be used in such a fashion that the whole constitutional ethos, our institutions can be destroyed. What is your use of this
Thank
money?
you very much. Yes, a historic judgment coming in, and Kapil Sibal, one of the lawyers representing the petitioners in this matter, the Supreme Court, headed by the Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud, 5-judge bench, striking down the electoral bond scheme, saying it is unconstitutional and that voters have the right to information, and there cannot be an arrangement which ensures that political parties have access to unlimited, unfettered capital without any restrictions and with the shroud of anonymity. Mr. Sibal, a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC TV18 with your take on the judgment that's been delivered by the Supreme Court just a short while from now. Well, that's the sum and substance, the import of the 5-judge bench Supreme Court judgment that's been delivered, striking down the constitutional validity of the electoral bond scheme. So basically, we wind back the clock, and all of the changes that were made to many acts, including the Companies Act, including amendments to do away with the restrictions on capping corporate donations, all of that now being wound down. State Bank of India will have to furnish the details of all the electoral bonds that have been purchased since 2019 and give that to the Election Commission. And as we just heard from Kapil Sibal there, it is likely that by the 13th or the 15th of March, those details, as per the Supreme Court order, will have to be made public, will be available for public consumption for you and me to see. But let me go back again to Ashmit, because he's been tracking the action. Well, we'll get back to Ashmit, but for now, I hand it back to you to take the markets forward.
Okay, all right, Shereen, thank you very much. That was a great conversation with some of the top legal minds in the country on what is a pretty historic day and a massive, massive judgment coming in from the Apex Court. Okay, let's take a quick break. On that note, we'll come back to markets full throttle in just a bit.